Nathan Prescott stared at the financial reports on his desk, his jaw tightening. The numbers didn't make sense. Employee wages were lower than they should be, but payroll reports showed full salaries being allocated. Something wasn't adding up. And the complaints, anonymous emails from employees mentioning underpayment, missing overtime wages, and even threats from management if they spoke up. Nathan had inherited the 9-location security company from his father, who built it from the ground up. He always believed in running the business with integrity, but lately he felt disconnected. Reports only told him so much. He needed to see the truth for himself. That's how he found himself slipping into a security guard uniform, a fake badge pinned to his chest. A professional disguise artist had helped alter his appearance: shorter hair, glasses, and a bit of facial stubble. He looked nothing like the CEO who occasionally appeared in corporate meetings. And since most of the store managers had never met him in person, there was no reason for them to suspect anything. His first stop was one of the busiest locations, a large warehouse that supplied security equipment. The manager, a man named Dennis, ran the place. Nathan had heard his name before, always praised for keeping labor costs low. But now he had to find out how. Walking into the warehouse, he immediately noticed the tension. Employees moved quickly, speaking in hushed tones. Some looked exhausted, others frustrated. A woman with a name ag that read Vanessa Carter was arguing with a supervisor near the loading dock. "I stayed 2 extra hours last night. That's overtime," she said, her voice tight with frustration. The supervisor, a stocky man with a clipboard, shook his head. "No, Dennis says we don't do overtime pay anymore." "You clocked out late? That's on you." Vanessa's hands clenched into fists. "That's illegal. And I." "Then quit," the supervisor cut her off. "You want to make a big deal out of it? There's plenty of people who'd take your job." Nathan's stomach twisted. He'd barely been here 10 minutes, and he was already seeing the problem unfold. He took a deep breath and walked toward Vanessa. "You okay?" he asked, keeping his voice casual. She turned, her frustration giving way to weary resignation. "Yeah, just another day here." Nathan nodded. He needed to see more before making his move. Over the next few hours, he observed how Dennis ran things. Employees were clocking in on time but being forced to clock out early while still working. Some were being paid under the table at lower rates to avoid overtime laws. And when someone questioned it, they were either threatened or ignored. Nathan couldn't believe it. His company was built on fairness and loyalty. His father would be furious if he saw this. As his shift neared its end, he saw Dennis himself walking out of his office. A tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, Dennis had the smug confidence of someone who knew he was untouchable. He clapped a worker on the back, laughing at some joke, completely oblivious to the frustration around him. Nathan's hands curled into fists at his sides. He needed proof. He needed to catch Dennis in the act. So he made a plan. He'd stay another shift, blend in with the employees, and see just how deep this corruption went. Nathan adjusted his cap as he stepped into the break room, blending in with the exhausted employees who had just finished their shifts. The air inside was thick with unspoken frustrations, the hum of the vending machine the only sound as workers slumped into plastic chairs. He grabbed a bottle of water from the counter and sat near Vanessa, who was rubbing her temples, staring at a blank spot on the wall. He had spent the last few hours taking note of everything happening around him. Workers were being pressured into clocking out early while still being expected to finish their tasks, and any complaints were met with thinly veiled threats. He had seen one of the younger employees hesitate at the time clock, clearly aware that logging too many hours would put them on Dennis's radar. A man with grease-stained sleeves and tired eyes dropped into the chair next to Vanessa. His name tag read Luis. He let out a weary sigh and leaned back. Vanessa glanced at him. "They short you again?" Luis nodded, his lips pressed into a thin line. "I was supposed to get paid for my extra shift last week. Checked my deposit this morning. It wasn't there." Nathan kept his expression neutral, though inside he was seething. Dennis wasn't just bending the rules, he was outright stealing from his employees. Vanessa scoffed, shaking her head. "I swear he's pocketing the difference. Payroll reports one amount, but we see another." Luis rubbed his jaw. "You ever notice how his car changes every few months? Last year he had that silver sedan. Now he's driving some luxury SUV. Nathan's stomach dropped. That wasn't just mismanagement, that was fraud. If Dennis was siphoning money from payroll, it was a serious crime. A sudden shout broke the tension in the break room. One of the younger workers, a guy barely out of his teens, was arguing with a supervisor near the door. "You said I'd get paid today," the worker said, voice shaking. "I need that money." The supervisor crossed his arms. Payroll had an issue. Next week. The worker's face fell. "I can't wait until next week. My rent's due." The supervisor shrugged. "Not my problem." Nathan felt his pulse quicken. He had seen enough. He took a slow breath, forcing himself to remain composed. If he blew his cover now, Dennis would have time to cover his tracks. He needed undeniable proof. The break room door swung open and Dennis entered, his presence immediately sucking the air out of the room. He glanced around, his gaze lingering on the young worker who had just been arguing. "Problem here?" Dennis asked. The supervisor shook his head. "No problem. Just a misunderstanding." Dennis's eyes narrowed. "Good. We don't need any unnecessary complaints." Nathan noticed how everyone in the room suddenly straightened, their expressions guarded. Dennis had them all walking on eggshells. Nathan needed to get into Dennis's office. If the payroll discrepancies were intentional, there had to be records. He had to find them before Dennis had a chance to cover his tracks. The next few hours were spent moving through the facility, keeping an ear open for any conversations that might lead him to what he needed. As he walked past the storage area, he spotted Dennis's assistant leaving the office with a stack of papers. The door was slightly ajar. This was his chance. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The office was cluttered but not chaotic. Filing cabinets lined one wall, a sleek computer set up on the desk. He moved quickly, checking the papers on the desk first. Invoices, schedules, and then payroll reports. He scanned them, his heart pounding. The official records showed full wages being paid, but the handwritten notes in the margins told a different story. Adjustments, deductions, names crossed out. He pulled out his phone and started snapping pictures. A noise outside made him freeze. Footsteps. He shoved the papers back and slipped out just in time to see Dennis returning. Dennis glanced at him. "What are you doing back here?" Nathan kept his expression neutral. "Supervisor told me to grab a form." Dennis studied him for a moment before nodding toward the door. "Next time, ask first." Nathan nodded and walked away, his mind racing. He had what he needed. Now it was time to act. Nathan left Dennis's office with his pulse hammering in his ears. The weight of what he had uncovered sat heavy in his chest. He had concrete evidence that Dennis was manipulating payroll, shortchanging employees, and likely pocketing the difference. Now he had to decide how to use it. Walking back through the warehouse, he focused on keeping his expression neutral. He couldn't afford to tip Dennis off. The man was shrewd, and if he suspected anything, he'd start covering his tracks before Nathan had the chance to act. The shift was winding down, and workers were gathering their things, preparing to head home. Nathan spotted Vanessa near the lockers, her shoulders stiff as she zipped up her bag. Luis was beside her, speaking in hushed tones, his face tight with frustration. Nathan approached casually, keeping his voice low. He needed to gauge just how deep the resentment ran among the employees. Luis muttered something under his breath, shaking his head. Vanessa let out a slow breath, her brow furrowed. Nathan caught snippets of their conversation, something about a coworker who had been fired for questioning his paycheck. That confirmed it. Dennis wasn't just skimming from wages. He was actively silencing anyone who tried to push back. Nathan made up his mind. It was time to confront Dennis. He walked toward the manager's office, pushing open the door without knocking. Dennis looked up from his desk, clearly irritated at the intrusion. Nathan shut the door behind him. The air in the room felt heavier now, the tension palpable. Dennis leaned back in his chair, studying him. "You need something?" Nathan placed the payroll documents he had photographed onto the desk. Dennis's gaze flicked to them, then back up to Nathan. His expression barely changed, but there was a flicker of something guarded. Nathan kept his tone measured. "I know what you're doing." Dennis didn't react immediately. He simply sat there, fingers tapping lightly against the armrest of his chair. Then, after a beat, he exhaled through his nose, as if mildly amused. "And what exactly do you think you know?" Nathan didn't hesitate. "You're altering payroll records. Employees are working hours they're not getting paid for. You're forcing them to clock out and keep working. And when they speak up, you threaten them or fire them." Dennis let out a slow, deliberate breath. His eyes darkened slightly, but he didn't deny anything. Instead, he reached for a pen on his desk, rolling it between his fingers. "You must be new," Dennis said, his tone calm. "Let me explain something. This place runs on efficiency. Payroll budgets don't stretch as far as corporate thinks they do. If I let every employee rack up overtime, this location wouldn't be profitable." Nathan's jaw tightened. "So you steal from them instead?" Dennis scoffed. "It's not stealing. It's managing resources. These people should be grateful they have jobs." Nathan's fingers curled into his palm. The sheer arrogance in Dennis's voice was staggering. The man truly believed he was justified in what he was doing. Nathan leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "You're not managing resources. You're taking money that doesn't belong to you. And I have the proof." Dennis's expression finally shifted, a flicker of unease crossing his face. He glanced at the documents on the desk, then back at Nathan. His fingers tightened around the pen. "You don't know who you're messing with," Dennis said, his voice quieter now. "You think corporate cares? They look at the bottom line. This location is one of the most profitable in the company. You think they'll side with some security guard over me?" Nathan held his ground. "I'm not just some security guard." Dennis's brow furrowed slightly, and then realization dawned in his eyes. He sat up straighter, his gaze locking onto Nathan's face with renewed scrutiny. "You're—" Nathan didn't let him finish. "I'm Nathan Prescott, CEO of this company. And you're done here." The color drained from Dennis's face. His mouth opened slightly, but for the first time since Nathan had met him, he was speechless. Nathan straightened. "Effective immediately, you're fired. Security will escort you out. And don't bother trying to destroy any records, I already have copies." Dennis's hands clenched into fists on the desk. "You don't understand business, Prescott. You think running a company is just about following rules? Sometimes you have to make tough choices." Nathan's voice was firm. "Stealing from employees isn't a tough choice. It's a crime." Dennis stared at him for a long moment, then let out a bitter laugh. He shook his head, muttering something under his breath before pushing back his chair and standing. "You'll regret this," Dennis said. "You have no idea how much money I made this company." Nathan didn't flinch. "I'd rather lose profit than lose my integrity." Dennis grabbed his jacket off the chair, his movements stiff with anger. As he walked past Nathan, he hesitated for just a second, as if considering one last word of defiance. But then he shook his head and left. Nathan let out a slow breath, steadying himself. The confrontation was over, but the work was just beginning. He stepped out of the office, meeting the eyes of the employees who had gathered nearby. They had clearly heard enough to know what had happened. Vanessa's eyes widened slightly. Luis looked stunned. Nathan addressed them directly. "Dennis is gone, and starting today, things are going to change." A murmur spread through the group: disbelief, relief, cautious hope. Nathan continued, "I'm going to personally review payroll records for every location. Anyone who was underpaid will get what they're owed, with interest. And from now on, if you work overtime, you'll be paid for it. No exceptions." Vanessa exhaled sharply, as if she'd been holding her breath for too long. Luis rubbed his face, shaking his head in disbelief. Nathan looked around at the gathered employees. "You all deserved better than this. And I promise it won't happen again." For the first time since he had walked into this warehouse, he saw something different in the employees' faces. Not just relief, but trust. And that, more than anything, told him he had made the right decision. Nathan stood in the warehouse, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. The employees around him were still absorbing what had just happened. Dennis was gone. The man who had controlled their paychecks, their schedules, their livelihoods expelled in an instant. Some looked stunned, others cautious, as if waiting for the other shoe to drop. But Nathan wasn't done yet. He walked toward the break room, signaling for Vanessa, Luis, and a few other employees to follow. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a stark glow over the worn-out tables and chairs. Nathan pulled out his phone and dialed his corporate office, asking for the HR department head to be put on speaker. The call connected and Nathan wasted no time. He instructed HR to begin an immediate audit of payroll records across all locations. If Dennis had been manipulating wages here, there was a good chance something similar was happening elsewhere. The employees listened, their expressions shifting from skepticism to something resembling cautious hope. When he ended the call, he looked at the group in front of him. Their faces told a story of exhaustion, of frustration built up over months, maybe years. Now, they were waiting to see if this was real, if he meant what he said. Nathan turned to Vanessa first. He had seen her stand up to the supervisors, refusing to back down even when she knew the consequences. He asked about the extent of the payroll issues, the pressure tactics, and how long it had been going on. She didn't hesitate. She spoke about employees being pushed to work extra hours off the clock, about checks arriving short without explanation, about how anyone who questioned it was made to feel replaceable. Luis added that some workers had started taking second jobs just to make up for the missing wages. Nathan absorbed every word. Every detail painted a clearer picture of just how deep Dennis's corruption ran. This wasn't an isolated mistake or poor management, this was systemic exploitation. He asked about morale, about whether anyone had gone to HR before. Vanessa explained that complaints had been made, but nothing changed. Dennis always had an excuse, a way to manipulate the numbers to make it seem like everything was above board. And when employees pushed too hard, they found themselves scheduled for fewer shifts or suddenly written up for minor infractions. Nathan's frustration deepened, but he kept his focus sharp. He assured them that things would change, that accountability was coming not just for Dennis, but for anyone else complicit in this. He promised back pay for every stolen dollar, and that supervisors who had enforced these unethical practices would face consequences. A shift in the air followed. People started exchanging glances, some murmuring among themselves. The disbelief was still there, but it was cracking, giving way to something else. Relief. Trust. Nathan didn't stop there. He asked about working conditions beyond wages. Luis mentioned that the equipment was outdated, making tasks harder than they needed to be. Another employee pointed out that schedules were erratic, making it impossible to plan for their lives outside of work. Nathan took note of everything. He hadn't realized how disconnected he had become from the day-to-day realities of his company, but he wasn't going to let that happen again. By the time he stepped out of the break room, the entire warehouse floor was buzzing with conversation. Word had spread fast. Employees were talking, some even smiling for the first time since he arrived. Before leaving, Nathan made one more decision. He walked over to Vanessa and told her he wanted her to step into a leadership role, someone who could advocate for employees and help implement the changes that were coming. She hesitated at first, clearly caught off guard. But then after a long moment, she nodded. Nathan left the warehouse knowing that the real work was just beginning. Firing Dennis wasn't the end of the problem, it was just the first step. The company needed to rebuild trust, to ensure policies were enforced properly, and to create a culture where employees weren't afraid to speak up. Over the next several weeks, Nathan followed through on every promise. The payroll audit revealed inconsistencies in multiple locations, leading to further investigations and more terminations where necessary. Employees received back pay, and new measures were put in place to prevent this from happening again. But more importantly, Nathan made sure he was no longer a distant figure sitting in an office reviewing reports. He visited locations regularly, speaking directly with employees, making sure they knew they were valued. The warehouse where it all started saw some of the biggest changes. With Dennis gone, a new manager was brought in, one who prioritized fairness and transparency. Work conditions improved, outdated equipment was replaced, and employees finally saw their concerns being addressed. Vanessa thrived in her new role. She became a direct line between workers and corporate leadership, ensuring that no one would ever feel unheard again. And as Nathan watched his company transform, he realized something important. This wasn't just about fixing a broken system. It was about rebuilding a foundation of trust, about proving that leadership wasn't just about profits, but about the people who made those profits possible. He had gone undercover to find answers. But in the end, he found something even more valuable, a company that could finally live up to the values it was meant to stand for. Nathan stepped out of the warehouse office and into the chilled evening air, the weight of the past few days still pressing against his shoulders. The confrontation with Dennis had been necessary, but it was just the start. The real challenge was making sure that lasting change took root. He walked through the loading dock, scanning the workers who were wrapping up their shifts. The usual tension that had lingered in their posture was beginning to ease, though wariness still clung to some of them. Change wouldn't happen overnight, and trust wasn't something that could be demanded. It had to be earned, step by step. He spotted Luis near the back entrance, securing a pallet with thick straps. The man glanced up, his face unreadable as he wiped his hands on his uniform. Nathan approached, knowing Luis had been one of the most vocal about the problems under Dennis's watch. Luis rested his forearm on the pallet, studying Nathan for a moment before speaking. His tone carried none of the frustration from before, just quiet consideration. He asked how far the investigation would go and whether it would stop at Dennis or extend beyond this location. Nathan didn't hesitate. Every branch of the company would be audited, and anyone found exploiting workers would face the same consequences Dennis had. That answer seemed to settle something in Luis's expression. A forklift beeped in the distance, maneuvering toward the docks, and Nathan took a step back to let the workers continue their tasks. He needed to keep moving. There were more people to talk to, more issues to uncover that a report would never fully capture. Inside the main floor, Vanessa was speaking with a few employees near the time clock. She had stepped into her new responsibilities quickly, and it was clear that people were already turning to her for guidance. Nathan observed as she listened intently to a worker explaining difficulties with the scheduling system. When their conversation ended, Vanessa caught sight of Nathan and approached, her expression serious. She had been compiling a list of concerns from employees, some tied to the wage theft Dennis had orchestrated, others revealing deeper inefficiencies in how shifts were assigned. She mentioned that several workers had been forced to work split shifts that left them with long hours but unpredictable pay. Others had been pressured into taking on responsibilities outside their job descriptions without additional compensation. Nathan absorbed each detail, already mentally mapping out the changes needed. Some of these issues weren't just the result of Dennis's corruption but a broader failure in oversight. It was clear that policies had been in place on paper but had never been properly enforced. Before Vanessa returned to her discussions, she hesitated, choosing her words carefully. She admitted that many employees were still skeptical about how long these reforms would last. They had seen promises before, temporary fixes that faded once management shifted its attention elsewhere. Nathan understood that concern. Words meant nothing without action, and the only way to prove things were different this time was through consistent follow-through. He told Vanessa that he wasn't leaving things to chance. A new oversight system would be implemented, making sure employees had a direct line to corporate if issues arose again. As she nodded, a voice called out from across the floor. One of the supervisors, a man who had worked under Dennis, was speaking with another employee, his tone clipped. Nathan recognized him as someone who had been complicit in enforcing Dennis's policies, though he hadn't been in a position of direct authority. Nathan watched carefully as the conversation unfolded. The supervisor was struggling to adjust to the new expectations. He had been part of the old system for so long that he didn't seem to know how to operate without the fear-based tactics Dennis had instilled. Nathan made a mental note to address this later. Some supervisors could be retrained, but others might need to be replaced altogether. It wasn't just about removing bad actors, it was about rebuilding the culture from the ground up. A few minutes later, Nathan made his way back toward the administrative office where a regional manager had just arrived in response to the unfolding situation. The man had been caught off guard by just how deeply the corruption ran, and now he was scrambling to assess the damage. Nathan wasted no time. He laid out the immediate actions that needed to be taken, adjusting payroll to reflect owed wages, restructuring shift policies, and ensuring that employees had a clear avenue to report misconduct in the future. The regional manager nodded along, but Nathan could tell he was still processing the scope of what had happened. As the conversation wrapped up, Nathan stepped outside for a moment of fresh air. The sky had darkened, the last traces of daylight fading beyond the horizon. The past few days had been exhausting, but he wasn't finished yet. He took out his phone and dialed his executive team. They needed to hear everything firsthand, not through second-hand reports. When the call connected, he detailed the full extent of what had been uncovered, not just Dennis's actions, but the systemic failures that had allowed them to continue unchecked. Silence hung on the line for a moment. Then came the questions: how had this gone unnoticed for so long, and what needed to be done to prevent it from happening again? Nathan had already anticipated these concerns, and his answers were ready. A complete overhaul of oversight procedures. Mandatory audits every quarter. Direct employee reporting channels that bypassed local management. By the time the call ended, the first steps toward permanent change were already in motion. As Nathan re-entered the warehouse, he felt the shift in the atmosphere. Employees were still cautious, still adjusting to the sudden changes. But there was something else now, a sense of possibility. It wouldn't be easy, and trust wouldn't be rebuilt overnight. But for the first time in a long while, the workers weren't just enduring their jobs. They were starting to believe that things could be different. And Nathan was determined to make sure they were right.